Okay, everyone. Good morning from Tokyo. Welcome to the ADBI annual conference, where for the next 2 days, we will ask the question of whether Asian economies can forge a high-income future and avoid burnout. Before we begin, I will go through some housekeeping rules. So for speakers, please turn off your video and mic before or after your presentation, so you can keep them on when you're presenting. There will be questions in the Q&A box, so you can answer them directly in the Q&A box if you wish, or we can discuss and then you can answer some of these questions live. If you want to discuss or ask something, you can raise your hand or type in the chat box. For the audience, you only have access to a question in the Q&A box, so you can write your question there, and then we will go over them or go through them when we have time and during the Q&A time. I also want to mention that we will have Russian and Mandarin interpretations, and what you need to do is you can press the interpretation button in Zoom and then pick the language that you want to hear the presentations in. If the icon is hidden, there should be a 3-dot menu where you can click and then get to that button. I will now read the consent to use without permission or compensation. This event may be photographed, streamed live, or video recorded. By attending, accepting connection, or continuing participation in this event, participants consent to the possible use of their name, likeness, voice, spoken or written comments, or papers presentations in whatever form in all media publications, video sharing websites, recordings, disseminations, or other external affairs purposes for ADB and ADBI without compensation or permission. As to the disclaimer, the views expressed in presentations are the views of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the ADBI, the ADB, its board of directors, or the governments they represent. ADB and ADBI do not guarantee the accuracy of the data included in presentations and accepts no responsibility for any consequences of their use. Terminology used may not necessarily be consistent with ADB official terms. So for everyone who are presenters or panelists, we will now have the customary group photo session. Please turn on your video, and somebody will do a countdown, and when it gets to 1 or 0, please make sure your eyes are open and you're smiling.
Okay, everybody, 3, 2, 1. Couple more. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone. So I think we are now going to the welcoming remarks from President Masa. So please bear with us while we load the pre-recorded video.
Good morning, and welcome to the annual conference of the ADB Institute. Asia is home to most of the world's middle-income countries. As they aim to attain high-income status over the next 2 decades, how can they build economies that are also inclusive and responsive to climate change? This year's conference addresses that important question. Middle-income countries cannot emulate the growth strategies of the past because the context and challenges are vastly different. Digital technology and AI, for example, have reshaped economies. This can either be a drag or a catalyst for growth. Countries must invest in human capital and increase state capability, as they are the conditions to fully utilize new technology. We also see the downsides of focusing solely on high levels of economic growth. Social gaps emerge, fertility rate decline, and above a certain level, there's no longer a positive correlation between happiness and income. And so, new growth strategies are needed. At ADB, we strive to deliver effective solutions to our region's development challenges, which have become even more complex. We are evolving so that we can tackle the climate crisis, ensure a just transition to a net zero future, and support growth that is sustainable and inclusive. I am certain that the ideas you take up at this conference will be of great value to this work and to other important stakeholders throughout the region. I wish you productive discussions ahead.
Okay, great. So after President Masa's remarks, we will have opening remarks from Dean Tetsushi Sonobe. So I will read quickly his profile before handing the microphone over to him. Tetsushi Sonobe is the Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute since April 2020. Prior to joining ADBI, Dean Sonobe was a Vice President of the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies, GRIPS, a public policy school in Tokyo. So Dean Sonobe, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning from Tokyo. So on behalf of ADB Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to the ADBI annual conference. As a flagship event, this conference aims to bring rigorous research on the timely topic into policy debate. This year, the topic we chose is economic growth, which is an age-old yet ever contentious topic. Many countries, or most countries in Asia and the Pacific, are middle-income economies. Some countries have been in the middle-income status for over 30 years. For them, the question of how to sustain the high growth to reach the high income status is a matter of great interest. The conditions or strategies enabling graduation from middle income to high income status are very likely to differ from those in the transition from low income to middle income. For example, graduation seems to require countries to establish competitive advantage in global markets and move up the ladder of value chains, which would in turn require public investments in science and technology. It also seems that the level of state capacity needs to be upgraded to mobilize domestic resources, attract foreign investment, and design and implement effective policies. Moreover, political stability and social cohesion seems to be required to avoid devastating reversions or regressions. However, underneath these seemingly common principles, each middle-income country must discover its own path to economic prosperity. The devil is in the details. The context in the current era are different from those in the era when the current high-income countries were in their transition from middle income. One of the apparent differences is a demographic change. Population aging begins in the middle income stage today, whereas it began after ranking in the high income status before. Another or more equally or more important difference is climate change, as President Masa emphasized. Nowadays, middle income countries need to internalize the environmental impact of economic growth. So uh, uh, this is new, and also nobody knows right answer yet. So this is a big challenge. So this year's annual conference features 8 prominent speakers and 15 distinguished discussants over 2 days. I'm extremely grateful to them for taking the time out of their busy schedule to share their insights and latest thinking. This conference is not a one-off event, but this is a start of a series of events where ADBI works on how countries in Asia and the Pacific can achieve the dual goal of economic and environmental development. The follow-up event will take place about half a year later, I hope. So please check our website for the follow-up event. So thank you very much for your attention. Now let's start the first session. So it's a really great pleasure to have 2 prominent economists in this first session as a keynote speaker and a discussant. The keynote speaker is Lant Pritchett, who has lived 5 different countries, including India and Indonesia, making while working for the World Bank, making 2 World Development Reports, teaching at Harvard Kennedy School and the London School of Economics, and serving as the director of the RISE program at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, and writing on a wide range of development issues and publishing 6 books. So based on these extremely rich experiences, including deep and wide research work, Lant will share his insights on the risks to sustained economic growth. Lant, thank you very much for taking the time to joining us this morning for Japan and Asia. Lant, the screen is yours for the next 45 minutes. Please start.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, successfully. There we go. So thanks for the kind introduction, and I'm thrilled to join. I'm in the west of the United States, so it's easier for me to join. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday. So Japan is well suited for the virtual conferences. I want to talk about one of what I think is a very important risk to sustained economic growth for the Asian countries, and that is the fact of the kind of jointness of the evolution of various dimensions of what I regard as national development, and the risks that are currently posed by the fact that many Asian countries, though not all, are making much more progress in economic growth than they are in the building of state capability, which I will define in a minute. So this is the outline of the presentation. The motivation is that national development is a 4-fold transformation, and hence the title of the 4-lane highway to prosperity. And just as motivation, it is the 4-foldness of the development process that really does deliver on high levels of human well-being. So we are right to have growth as a goal, but we're also right to have these other elements of national development as a goal. So the second is since 1990, when Francis Fukuyama, an American scholar, famously declared the end of history, that all economies were going to be converging towards kind of the same conditions of managed capitalism, state bureaucracy, and democracy. We've had many economic successes, but less success on the other dimensions. So that sort of motivation leads to part three, where I want to look at the current episodes of rapid growth, but show that in many of these cases, the evolution of state capability, and again, I'll define that in a minute, isn't keeping pace with the pace of economic growth, or I think very rapid growth, but stagnating or even declining state capability. And that is creating sort of, if you project that into the future, it's very difficult to project the joint trends of rapid economic growth and stagnant state capability in the future, because it becomes increasingly implausible given what we observe as the cross-national relationship. Then finally, I want to come to kind of a conjecture theory narrative model. Those are all slashes because doesn't rise yet to the level of theory, but more a narrative about the dangers of the negative feedback loops that the successful growth strategies, even though they're successful in promoting growth, may have for long-run national development. So that's the thing. And fundamentally, I'm worried that many countries are on a path that is going to end in ways like Bangladesh's, and we don't know what the future of the end of the current episode in Bangladesh is, but it ended in a way that I think easily and was predicted, given the way it was pursuing economic growth. So first, just as motivation, I want to think about national development as a way in which countries develop modalities in which the citizens, and maybe others, but the citizens of the country cooperate, and they cooperate to accomplish purposes. So moving around, there's a transition from low productivity to high productivity, in which people increasingly cooperate in more sophisticated production that requires deeper and more complex value chains. There's a transition from subject to citizen, that the polity creates government responsiveness to the needs and wishes of its citizens. I'm not using the word democracy. I'm using the word that the polity, the way in which the political authorities are chosen and are accountable, is responsive to the citizens. There's a sense of equal treatment of the fellow citizens. There's a transition to some semblance of social coherence, in which people regard it as legitimate that all citizens be treated equally before the law in particular. And lastly, sort of capable organizations of administration that can govern. And by govern, I mean both rule and serve, both have capability of relations that exist for the country, but also create effective public services. Now, this is what I call the 4-lane highway to prosperity, and it sets a set of challenges which are, not the same challenge. One is to create, what it takes to allow people to cooperate in sophisticated and predictable ways and make investments that pay off, that enables a vibrant and innovative economy. They have to create mechanisms of determining who controls the power of the state and what the limitations on the exercise of that power are, such that the state roughly pursues the interests of the citizens and protects the ability of humans to flourish on their own terms. That is, protects freedom and human rights. State capability for policy implementation, which I'm going to focus on quite a bit in the presentation, is the creative organizations of the state. And I'm trying to avoid the word institutions, because I find the word institutions vague, but organizations have an address. You can mail them something. They have a legal existence. So I'm talking about the organization of the state in order that they can both impose obligations, collect taxes, prevent criminality, regulate, and provide services that are both effective in the sense of means to ends rational, and implement those with adequate fidelity, and that those organizations themselves are constrained in their exercise of power. Meaning, when I define capability, I embed in that definition rule of law, that the organization isn't excessively capable and can't just do anything to anyone. And last, social coherence. And I think these are the four things. And when I have a recent paper in which I tried to look at the relationship between aggregate kind of omnibus indicators of social progress and national development, because I think the ongoing theory of development was that if we could get to national development, that would naturally and inevitably or causally lead to high levels of human well-being. And, it's important to check on your assumptions every now and again. And so I looked at measures called a social progress index that aggregates up 50 measures of progress that I think nearly all of us would agree are valid measures of the well-being of the people in the country, education, health, access to water and sanitation, and more sophisticated things like prevention of criminality, crime, and security and rights. And it really is the case that national development is essentially necessary and sufficient for high levels of human well-being. And it's not defined in. So I take GDP per capita, the measure of state capability I'm going to talk about, and a measure of democracy. And empirically, in a multivariate regression framework, those basically account for all of the variation, or most of the variation. And this graph is what I call an envelopment curve. So inside that envelope is every country experience in the world. And that's important because this isn't just a kind of, this isn't that there's a strong relationship, but there's outliers. Basically, there's no one in the Northwest. No country has high social progress index, high levels of human well-being, and low national development. And conversely, no country gets to high national development and low social progress. So we are right to focus on national development, and we're right in some sense to focus on all three dimensions. This isn't just economic growth. It's also the ability of the state to be responsive to and do what it takes both to support economic growth, but also to support directly the citizens. So so if we think of this development process as having at least these four elements, broadly speaking, then, economists spend a lot of time thinking about the determinants or causes of economic growth, but we also want to ask about, do these various elements of national development kind of naturally or inevitably go together? And if so, what is the dynamics of that process? What is it about state capability that facilitates economic growth? What is it about economic growth that facilitates or not state capability? Similar with democracy, although I'm not going to talk about democracy here today. So the question is, for instance, and I think this is a research question since this is a research conference, is do growth strategies that successfully create episodes of rapid economic growth necessarily or even usually encourage state capability? So, if both growth and capability are important to human well-being, it would be great if they went together. If what you did to create growth also simultaneously created pressures towards higher capability. Or are the growth strategies that actually depend for their success on undermining state capability? And if so, if your growth strategy isn't compatible with expanding and maybe even depreciating or running down state capability, this may lead to limitations on the growth strategies and particularly limit their success in reaching high levels of GDP per capita. So you may be on a strategy that can move you from low levels of income to middle income, but if your tactics and strategy for getting from low level to middle level was depreciating the asset of state capability, that may inhibit you having the state capability you need to go from middle to high income. So I want to start with kind of bringing together two big facts about the world that should be well known, but maybe aren't commonly, I don't see them discussed, which is, at least until COVID, there was lots of good news about economic growth. Whereas I, in 1990s, wrote a paper called Divergence Big Time, pointing out that the incomes of the rich and poor countries was continuing to diverge, the period since 1990 has seen lots of rapid growth experiences. It seems that convergence in absolute terms has become prominent since has started to happen since 1990. Not super rapid, but it was convergent. So, in fact, we were getting the majority of developing countries into converging growth. Obviously, the two populations, India and China. So by and large, the period since the 1990s, and particularly so in Asia, have been a pretty good period for economic growth. On the other hand, when I've written a book about state capability in which we develop a measure of state capability for policy implementation. This is not the capability of doing anything or everything. This is really focused on 4 measures of rule of law, bureaucratic effectiveness, regulatory quality, and control of corruption. So this is sort of focused on, do the organizations responsible for the enforcement of the regulatory and legal structure of the country, are they effective? Are they promoting, are they implementing with fidelity to the law and to the, do they have the capability to enforce the law? And by and large, the world's been in a big stuck, which means more countries have seen negative trends in state capability than have seen positive trends in state capability. So unlike growth, now this this naturally implies that there must have been at least a fair number of growth accelerations that were not either the result of improved state capability, nor did they improve it. So we have the reality that many countries are actually progressing very rapidly in the dimension of growth and increasing their GDP per capita, but appear to be stagnating in the evolution of state capability. So, okay. I'm sorry about rolling back and forth on slides. I know that's irritating. Oh, no, it is here. So basically, my measure of state capability, which is on the vertical axis, is measured from 1 to 100 across all countries in the world. And it takes the 2010 from the world governance indicators. There are 4 indicators: control of corruption, regulatory quality, government effectiveness, and rule of law. Those are so when I say in this presentation, I'm an empiricist. So when I say state capability or state capability for implementation or for policy implementation, this is what I mean. I mean the average of these 4 indicators. I've done over the course of my life analysis using multiple different indicators of state capability, and by and large, they're quite highly correlated across countries and reasonably correlated across time. So I don't think this analysis would be any different if I used any different aggregate measure of what I'm a different measure of what I'm talking about. I'm not talking, again, this isn't about everything the state does. It's not a measure of military capability. And there is a sort of strong cross-national relationship. There are 3 different ways. One is just the orange line, is just a log regression. The purple line is a quartic to allow for flexibility, and the green is a rolling median, so a completely robust non-parametric measure of this association. And in particular, what you see is, all the old developed countries are in this very high GDP, very high state capability. And again, Italy is famously low capability for its income. But by and large, and there are, by the way, out of this graph, because I had to truncate it at 75 or else it loses resolution. There are other countries. Japan is here, Korea is here, Singapore is here, Hong Kong is here. So there are non-Western countries in this box, but it's striking how few developing countries have made it up into this region of the space over the last 50 or 60 years of the development process. Similarly, you know, the bottom 40% of state capability and the bottom 40% of income are kind of a concentrated box. So not many countries with very low GDP have super high capability, and not many countries with super low capability have very high GDP, which way did I say it? So most of the countries that are poor have low capability. Most of the countries that have low capability have low income. So this is a reasonably strong and robust sort of fact about the world, that these two measures have a reasonably strong tendency to move together with, you know, as you observe, a lot of variation. So now the big stuck is that these are slightly old calculations, but I can't redo them every time. This just classifies countries by both their level of capability, breaking them into categories where strong capability is essentially the lowest of the developed countries, and then their progress. And what you see is there's very few countries up in the strong capability box, traditional developing countries. And again, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong are up there. The developed Japan, I count as a developed country, is not up there. And then what's more worrisome is that most of the countries in the world have been on a slow, the most frequent experience is that countries have been on a slow deterioration of this measure of state capability. And this, by the way, is 1 to 10, not 1 to 100, like the numbers I'm using today. So this means that the countries are deteriorating in capability. So if you ask how long would it take them to reach high capability, well, the answer is negative. They're going the wrong direction. And very few countries are actually on track to reach high state capability in the near future. For all the countries that have positive growth, I calculate the years to reach high capability. And for most of the countries, they're having very slow positive growth. So, you know, I'm not showing these numbers, but for Ghana, it was like 600 years. So they were growing, but they weren't improving so fast that it was going to happen in the foreseeable future. So, you know, what that means, of course, is that since countries have low capability and capability hasn't been systematically improving, if you look at this as showing the experience of growth and the level of state capability, you see lots of countries taking off from experiences of very low capability. You know, so matter of fact, nearly all of the episodes of very rapid growth, if we take very rapid growth as being about 4% sustained from 96 to 2022, most of these are, you know, among countries that began the period with very low capability. Bangladesh is among them. Vietnam is among them. China is just on the verge of you know, bottom 40th percentile capability at the beginning of the period. And, you know, many, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar are all in this countries that began the period with very low capability and have had very, very rapid growth over this period. So it isn't the case, you know, when Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson or North are discussed and people say good institutions are good, they often say they're good for growth, but that's not the reality. Good institutions are important for achieving very high levels, but they're not an inhibitor to initiating episodes of growth. But what is also the case is that most of the examples of very low growth come from low capability countries. So the variance among countries with low capability is twice as large as the variance among countries with high capability. And so partly this raises the concern that this variation in countries is both across countries and in other research I've shown over time. If you have a low capability country, it's much more likely to have both periods of rapid growth and periods of rapid decline. And there is some positive association in the extent to which countries improve their capability and their pace of growth, but it's pretty weak. So again, the orange line is the kind of bivariate association of these two things, which is the change in capability over the period and the pace of growth. And what you see is there's a fair number of countries with quite rapid growth and falling state capability. So the the deterioration of their capability has not, as of yet, prevented them from having these rapid episodes. And in this light yellow box, there's a striking number of, and this is basically above average growth for all countries, unconditional on state capability. Here's Malaysia, here's Cambodia, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but in this box are Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Malaysia. So there's a fair number of countries that have succeeded in creating both above average and often quite rapid growth, while at the same time not really having strong improvement. Those in the yellow box have had sort of about less than 3 points on a 1 to 100 point scale in their state capability over this entire period. So they're not on track to get to the 70-ish level that is the kind of minimum of high income countries. So, and there have been, I take a recent paper that I should have shown you the source here, but I don't. Anyway, I look at episodes of growth accelerations that were identified in a recent paper as periods of accelerations to rapid growth, and it dates it from the beginning to maybe the end of rapid growth. And what's striking is that in many of these episodes, GDP per capita in percentage on a 0 to, so I rescale GDP, so it also is on a 1 to 100 scale, and then take the percentage growth. I'm trying to make these two numbers as comparable as possible, but you see countries with just enormous progress in GDP per capita and modest, at best, progress in state capability. So, and sometimes negative. So Laos, a very had an extended period of acceleration from 94 to 2018. The measured state capability over that period fell. Cambodia, similarly, 1919 to 2019, very rapid growth, state capability over that period fell. So what I'm doing is a empirical exercise. Sorry, somebody. Sorry, I'm checking the time to make sure. I want to give plenty of time for Q&A. So I think I'm on schedule here.
Yeah, you're on schedule. You have 20 minutes or more.
20 minutes. Good. Okay. I will plan on ending 6 o'clock my time. So thanks. So kind of using these trends, I create some hypothetical exercises that are just pure hypotheticals. They're not projections. They're not forecasts. They just ask the question, what would happen if current trends persisted? So in this graph, I have on the sort of left axis, the measure of state capability, and on the right axis, I have GDP per capita. And I just say, first of all, what would happen if, and this country's Bangladesh, chosen because it had obviously recent political events that I think are focus the mind a bit. So what would have happened if Bangladesh's growth rate of 4.1% were extended to 2050? So say it somehow managed 28 more years of sustained growth at its recent past rate. What would its GDP per capita be? And the answer is 24,000. So it wouldn't yet be super high income, but it would be certainly in the range of upper middle income countries. Then the pink line says, given the cross-sectional relationship I showed you above, what would the state capability of countries with 24,000 in GDP look like? So this would be the evolution of state capability that would be consistent with the pace of progress of GDP. So if your state capability and GDP were developing along, in some sense, the way you would expect from the cross-national relationship, Bangladesh would be on the pink line. And then the green line is the actual evolution from 1996 to 2022 of state capability. And then I either extrapolate the entire period or the last 10 years of growth. And those are the two bottom lines. So over the last, and I think I don't follow Bangladesh closely, but I think no one would be surprised if I told them that the pace of growth of state capability in Bangladesh was measured to be very slow over the last 10 years. And so then I ask, what's the level of GDP of the level that would have the level of state capability Bangladesh is extrapolated at its current progress in state capability to have in 2050? So this creates kind of two measures of the gap between what extrapolation of the future would portend and kind of what the cross-national association suggests. So we have a we have a state capability gap, which is, you know, if state capability in Bangladesh were consistent with its high income from extrapolating growth, it would be 55 on a 1 to 100 scale. And instead, it's forecast to be in the mid 30s. So there's a 18-point gap between what it would have if it were like a country that were as rich as it was extrapolated to be, and what it's extrapolated to be on the history of state capability. And one can look at it maybe even more dramatically in the other way, which is what's the income you would expect a country with that level of capability to have in 2050, just based on the 2022 cross-section? And that's $5.7 thousand. That's poorer than it is today. So, you know, extrapolation of growth suggests Bangladesh could be as rich as 24,000. If you say, what would I expect from extrapolating state capability? I would expect actually Bangladesh to be poorer in the future than it is today. And the gap between those is enormous. And again, enormous, right? If you say, if your forecast of the future is Bangladesh will have the GDP per capita corresponding to its level of capability, it's going to be 6,000. If you extrapolate its growth and say it can do whatever it wants, and independent of state capability, it would rise to 24,000. These are not like minor differences. This is a factor of 4 in what you might think the future of Bangladesh's GDP looks like. So, and I just illustrate this by looking, here's Bangladesh in 22. It has slightly lower state capability already than you would have expected for its level of income. But if we just, again, extrapolate the two variables without taking into account that one is going to put a check on the other, Bangladesh would be far and away, other than Belarus, BLR, it would be kind of substantially, not just below the kind of expected level, but it would be the lowest state capability state at anywhere near its level of $24,000 in income. So I'm just illustrating what these extrapolations suggest. And the extrapolations suggest that forecasting, the two trends into the future leads to some obvious tensions. And they're even, larger, say, for Laos, because Laos is growing. And by the way, in the paper that I've written for this conference, each of these graphs for every country in Asia is in the paper. So you could compare and contrast, but I'll get to a minute. But if you think Laos, it's growing even faster than Bangladesh, but its state capability over the last 10 years has been deteriorating. Again, Laos by 2050, again, extrapolating its rapid growth, it would be have income of 30 some thousand, whereas extrapolating, and this obviously puts it with an income of a country like Turkey, but with a capability of a country like Bolivia. So now there's nothing inevitable in this calculation that produces this. This is just so Indonesia, for instance, starts with higher capability than its level of income would predict. And over the last 10 years, the data said there's been substantial improvement. So it actually would be even further above the line, would have even higher capability relative to its income. So it would reach levels of 30,000 GDP, but would have state capability consistent or even better than other countries at that level of income. So I do this calculation for every country in Asia. And again, it's not a forecast, not a prediction. It's just if we think about, can Asian countries forge a high income future? I'm thinking, can they forge a high income future without a high state capability future? And that's what the current trends predict for many countries, is a high income, low capability future. So again, these are sorted by kind of the biggest gap between predicted GDP from its extrapolated capability and predicted GDP from its extrapolated growth. In countries like Myanmar is predicted to have an income of 41,000 by 2050, but at its state capability progress, it would be predicted to have an income of 6,500. So now some countries, if we go down this chart, which is sorted again by the gap, some countries actually have a small gap, like the Philippines, in part because they're not really forecast to grow that robustly. So if you haven't had robust growth, then you don't have this tension as much, even though you have although with the Philippines, they have negative growth in capability, so they would be forecast to be even poorer than they are today. And some countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, Vietnam is on a trajectory of state capability such that it, wouldn't be inconsistent to forecast that it would be a high income country. Indonesia, again, is forecast to be, 32,000, which puts it, up near Turkey and other, on the verge of developed countries, and is forecast to have, state capability that would sustain an even higher GDP. South Asia has similar differences. Sri Lanka, again, is forecast to be a high income country, but its state capability has been going in reverse over the last 10 years. So if that trend persisted, they would be much poorer than they are. Bangladesh is the country I showed you. Now, some countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan don't have big gaps because they haven't had good growth. So some countries haven't managed to create the kinds of growth rates where anybody is imagining them in high income status. And India, and I have to say, I've been going to India since 1992 and lived there for 4 years off and on, and go there probably twice a year. This is maybe the most surprising finding to me from this research, is that according to these extrapolations, India is also gaining state capability very fast, and its state capability would be higher. So all of that is really just to set up this question, which is, what the hell is going to happen? Do we really think that Myanmar or Laos or Cambodia can continue towards high income status with very low and deteriorating levels of state capability? This would put them, and that's kind of the yellow dotted line is the extrapolation in which they get further and further from the capability GDP relationship. Maybe it's possible to do it, but no one's done it before. And so we don't have any historical experience. We don't really know what that would look like. Another possibility is that, yes, they've been having high growth, but without high capability, but there's going to be a dramatic shift in the evolution of their capability, and their state capability will come to, be higher in the future, and they'll kind of be more consistent. Their capability, GDP will be more consistent. Third possibility is, and that's the blue lack of arrow, is that just the lack of capability, they've made progress to where they are on the basis of a growth strategy they could implement with low capability, but they're coming to the end of those possibilities. And if they, without something happening in terms of either growth strategy or state capability strategy, they'll just stagnate and kind of stay where they are so that they don't continue to make progress in the GDP dimension or state capability dimension. So that's the stagnant. Or you could get, a reversal of growth. You could get more consistent with the GDP state capability relationship by both of them deteriorating or GDP falling back to be more consistent with the level of state capability. So we have had countries in the world in which political shocks have interrupted very rapid periods of growth, and essentially had massive falls in GDP that have then made them tragically more consistent between state capability and their GDP level. Iran is an example of a country that had very rapid growth under the Shah, ended dramatically with the Islamic Revolution, and now Iran looks more consistent with the GDP state capability line because its GDP is so much lower. I think as a research question, this is like super important. How do we think about this? How do we think about the joint evolution and feedback loops between economic growth and state capability? And can we really imagine and envision futures in which Asian countries with low and declining or low and stagnant levels of capability are nevertheless able to attain high income status? I obviously, you can tell maybe by the tone of my voice, I'm very skeptical that somebody's going to invent a new way to be other than mineral wealth. And again, these graphs I'm showing you exclude the Saudi Arabias and Kuwaits of the world because you can't choose to have their oil endowment. So maybe there is a way to both, to move off this relationship and continue to attain prosperity. It's just like I say, we haven't seen it historically, except in mineral-rich countries. So this is, I think, everything I'm going to say now is conjecture. Everything I've said to date is framing of a question I think is super important, and I just don't know that we're paying enough research attention to the ways in which these two phenomena of national development co-evolve and the joint feedback loops between the two. Now I'm going to conclude with 7 minutes of conjecture. I like to stop on time. And I think and I just want to talk about sort of what I think is going on in this high growth, low capability, negative capability growth countries, which is the way kind of Fukuyama imagined the future was going to evolve when he said there was an end of history and countries were going to converge to similar paths and modalities of development. I think he sort of thought there was private sector of firms and entrepreneurs that wanted laws and policies consistent with economic growth. And I'm not talking laissez-faire, I'm just saying consistent with dynamism, entrepreneurship, sophisticated production. And that if those got too far away, one of two things would happen. Either the feedback loop through politics would happen and that would get fixed, or countries wouldn't grow. So the idea was, we kind of know what countries look like, what the policies look like that get countries there, and these policies would be implemented with fidelity by organizations with strong capability, and an electoral democracy would exist to manage the political dimensions. And if an electoral democracy managed to create sustained growth that was kind of produced broad-based prosperity, they would manage to, be able to command electoral majorities for good policies. growth supporting policies. Now, what happened, I feel, was an option I know I certainly didn't anticipate strongly enough, which is countries just managed to create growth by having laws they didn't enforce. So rather than have good laws, they had actually very bad laws. But rather than those bad laws causing poor economic performance, they created mechanisms around those laws. So they stopped living by the rules and started living by deals. And so with a deal, the low capability of the state for regular enforcement didn't matter. And the electoral process didn't really need to suffer the pain of changing these laws. And essentially, you created two tracks of the private sector. You created closed order deals. You created what I call closed order deals, in which preferred investors, and preferred investors could either be by sector, they could be by nationality. You could prefer foreign investors and cocoon them from the regulatory environment of your country. You could prefer politically favored investors, but you created a category of preferred investors whose expectations for high and stable profits from their investments was secured not by rule of law or expectation they would conform with the law, but by political deals. And so the onset of closed order deals actually created the growth acceleration. And I'm just going to kind of skip over this pretty quickly, but there are real facts about, if you look at the World Bank's data of their doing business indicators that talks about how much time or effort or money would it take you to do certain things if you followed the law, and then look at enterprise surveys where firms said this is how much time it took them, they're completely uncorrelated. First of all, the de jure days, the kind of law days, are just radically higher. The typical de jure days in a country is 6 months. The typical de facto is about 1 month. Second, the variability across firms within the country is large. So these doing business indicators would report one number per country. Whereas if you ask people, which is what's being shown on this graph, the kind of 25th percentile answer was a week, and the 90th percentile answer was 3 months. So the law didn't necessarily predict the reality across firms. The correlation of the de jure and de facto across countries is very low. So countries with a doing business time to get a construction permit of a year had exactly the same actual time as countries for whom it was 180 days and for countries for whom it was 2 years. And, but the variance was larger. So this is just a very complicated graph, but basically it shows the relationship between the doing business time to get a construction permit on the horizontal axis, which varies between, 90 days to 600 days. But for the quick firms, there are a whole bunch of firms that get the construction permit quick. If you look at the 90th percentile, when you have a law that says it takes you 280 days, you can cause 10% of the firms to take 280 days. So there's a famous phrase in Latin America, and I'll say it in Spanish because it rhymes in Spanish: por mis amigos, todo; para mis enemigos, la ley. That is, for my friends, anything; for my enemies, the law, where the law is essentially a punishment. So here's a narrative of successful growth episodes that can lead to the phenomena we observe. Country starts from low levels of income, kind of bad macro policy, weak institutions, laws and regulations that are, not compatible with a thriving private sector. And then a political settlement arises that does, first of all, fixes the macro problems, adopts an outward-oriented status towards foreign investment and trade and becomes export promoted, but doesn't fix the laws, but creates closed-order deals for selected investors. So people can invest with confidence if they trust the political settlement, and you can actually create growth this way. You can create extended growth this way. But it's not secured by the rule of law. It's secured by the political settlement. And it's a deal. It's not open to everyone, right? You have to have this deal. Now, the problem is, and 2 slides from ending, the problem with this is that for closed order deals to be successful at creating reliable investor expectations, you can't have independent, strongly normed organizations of enforcement pursuing the rule of law. You can't both selectively non-enforce the law and have strong, capable law enforcement. So you can have environmental regulations that have all these bells and whistles and say what every firm needs to do. But if you exempt the favored investors from these, you can't obviously have a mechanism of enforcement that is strongly normed to treat every investor equally. So this can undermine public sector organizations as their internalized norms become non-compliance and an accommodation of political pressure. People inside the organization understand that, there's a famous phrase among top civil servants in India, show me the face and I'll show you the law. They internalize the norm that the rule of law is not for everyone and it's not neutral. And this, pushes those outside the bubble of closed order deals into a completely different deals environment. And they have to cope with potentially chaotic deals. And what happens politically when you have a closed order deals environment is initially the growth rate legitimizes the political settlement because growth is good and it benefits lots of others. Even if it is concentrated on the closed orders, it spills out to benefit others. But eventually you generate tensions between the people in the closed order deals and people in the open disorder deal economies. Public sector notions are norm deteriorated so that not only do they not enforce the law, the government can use them to attack their enemies as well as reward friends, meaning if the tax agency is taking bribes to not collect taxes, they can also respond to government requests to go after their enemies. And electoral democracy is just very hard to sustain without rule of law. That's a big typo, isn't it? As the stakes of winning are just too high. If I control the government, by controlling the government, I control discretionary treatment of every citizen. It's not an environment in which you can stand to lose. And so essentially the regime running the closed order deal growth can end suddenly with an irregular transfer of power. But unfortunately, with deteriorated norms in public sector organizations, still the same laws that are unenforceable, and it's very hard to reconstitute a deal. So the Bangladesh miracle was not a miracle. It wasn't a development miracle. It was a growth miracle, or a growth paradox, perhaps. There's a book just came out recently about Bangladesh's growth paradox, but they grew, but at the same time, well before the events of August, all the red lights were flashing that the state within Bangladesh was no longer a liberal democracy. It was, on the fragile states, it was looking more and more like a fragile state. Rule of law had deteriorated, press freedom had deteriorated, corruption had deteriorated. And so that's kind of the end state of a closed order deal growth episode in which there was no positive feedback loops from the growth to either state capability or democracy. So this is not to say there's a single Western quote unquote way to produce high income. There are myriads of ways to produce the same functional. We don't need isomorphism. But these sequencing and feedback loops between growth strategies, laws and policies, state capability, and political transitions is likely to be historically contingent and context specific. But what separates the big research question in my mind is what separates the highly successful cases like Korea that began in a non-democratic environment with closed order deals, but managed to make the transition from once exiting the 4-lane highway in ways that are going to be obstacles to their ever attaining high income status. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lant, for excellent presentation. We have excellent discussant, who is Professor Haruhiro. He has worked mainly on the economies of Southeast Asia and taught at many universities, including Australian National University, UP, I mean the University of the Philippines, Gajah Mada, and Oxford University, Columbia University, and so on, and served on various boards and committees such as Board of Bank Indonesia Institute, Board of ANU, Macquarie University, Monash University, and given advice to the Australian government, Indonesian government, ADB, thank you very much, and the World Bank and the United Nations agencies. Now, the Professor Harhill provides his comments on Lant's presentation for 15 minutes or less.
Thanks very much, Tetsushi. Good morning from Canberra, and good evening to Lant. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this interesting conference. So first basic question, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Good, thank you. Okay, so this is a highly stimulating paper by one of the world's leading development economists. Lant always makes you think. He poses a central question, that is episodic economic growth, often of decades duration, is it sustainable? He introduces the notion of state capability, argues plausibly, in my view, that high state capability is very likely a prerequisite for the growth acceleration over the medium term to be sustained. He worries that at some point countries might slow down because they get caught in this, what he calls the great stuck, which in some ways is a little bit analogous to the middle incomer trap, although it's different. Then he introduces a possible Bangladesh scenario, for example. I like the way he employs a very rich database. Innovatively, it's cross-country, it's over time, looking back and forward. And he also has lots of interesting country examples based on his own experience. So this is a great way to start this conference. There's arguably no more important question than the one he poses. So I'm going to make two general observations and then a number of more specific comments. And I should add, I've worked mainly, not only, but worked mainly on Southeast Asian countries. So I'm going to probably frame some of my questions based on some of these country experiences. So a couple of general observations to begin with. First one, not in any sense a criticism of the paper, but just a general plea for modesty in our economics profession, in spite of the ever more sophisticated statistical tools and the richer databases. Economists' track record in making forward-looking prognostications, Lant's careful not to call them forecasts rightly. Our record is pretty mixed. We haven't found a silver bullet, and we're probably never going to find a silver bullet. You know, the great hopes for growth accounting, for growth econometrics, haven't really generated fundamental insights, in my view, although they're useful. Another general point to make is there's no one analytical schema that provides all the answers. A strength of this paper is that it has a very clear and plausible analytical framework. It takes data seriously and it's comparative. I think that's the way we should all do development economics. In my ideal world, this would be combined with the sort of work, for example, that the late Angus Maddison used to sponsor, which is thinking comparatively, but then doing what he used to call analytical country narratives, which often provide the real insights which are needed to supplement this large cross-country data. That's the first general point. Second general point is I think it's essential when we're thinking about development, looking forward and back, we have to understand countries' political economy. We have to understand who has the power, what are their objectives or preferences, and is their hold on authority durable? It seems to me that a central part of the story is is that there has to be an elite commitment somehow to find different kinds of elites, different kind of countries as a starting point. And some of the very productive thinking in this area occurs at the intersection of economics and political science. A good recent example is the Stefan Durkheim Gambling on Development book. And in a sense, this is consistent with what's really the implicit framework of Lant's paper. I'll come back to that later. So some particular comments on along these themes. First of all, the notion of state capability, and more broadly the elusive conceptual and empirical search for workable definitions of whatever you want to call them, organizations or institutions. Lant relies on the WGI, the 4 indicators within the WGI set. This makes sense. We all use them and we all rely on them, and they have by and large stood the test of time. But they do come with caveats. It's worth just keeping in mind these caveats. They are subjective. All metrics are vulnerable to gaming. Being at a university, I understand this very well. And there is the potential for politicization. That was obviously the case with the discontinued ease of doing business indicators. My sense is the WGI are not political, at least they're much less subject to political interference, but we need to keep in mind the metrics. And that relates to a more general point. There's a trade-off between the obvious appeal of a single metric and the messy reality of the real world. And one dimension which I think is crucial, it comes out implicitly in Lant's presentation, is the distinction between macroeconomic policy and what might be called microeconomics and distributional policies. I think many developing countries have learnt the painful lesson that bad macro, quote unquote, loose fiscal monetary policy, lax financial supervision, exchange rate misalignments, is very costly. And so in different forms, there seems to have emerged in many countries a political consensus that it's best to have professional independent central banks and legislated or some other restriction on the magnitude of fiscal deficits, and then the policy battles and over ideology and rents occurs at the micro and distributional level. I think that the successful Southeast Asian countries clearly illustrate this proposition. Indonesia, especially after 1997-98, Philippines after its huge crisis in the mid-1980s, Malaysia and Thailand. Not unfair to characterize their politics as pretty messy, but they do have this fairly good macroeconomic framework. And why is this relevant? It's because it means that one of the huge sources of economic instability and growth interruptions is by and large removed from the range of possibilities, and that means that it's sort of pro-growth in that sense. So that's the question in a way for the WGI indicators. Does it dig deeply enough into these factors? I can see arguments for and against. A similar argument, by the way, can be made, especially for the Southeast Asian countries, although not as powerfully, that trade policy has had a somewhat similar operation that through the membership of the ASEAN group. ASEAN doesn't set the bar particularly high for trade policy, but it has worked as a kind of constraint on trade and commercial policy excesses, especially in an era of mobile capital, where mobile capital can quickly flow between countries. So in other words, if you get the macro and trade policy more or less right, that explains a fair bit of growth. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, and that links to the state capability issue. Just as an aside, this issue of institutions rule, quote unquote, I know Lant doesn't use that phrase for sensible reasons, but it's a very popular point. The relationship between institutions and economic growth is obviously bidirectional. I've always worried a bit about this very popular notion, institutions rule, associated with Danny Roderick and others. And the most compelling caveat I've found is the one that Jagdish Bhagwati used to use. And that is with reference to India, he made the point that India had this wonderful Indian administrative service, considered a model in many other countries for how to run governments. But over time, as India closed up and the license Raj took over, there was a sort of institutional degradation. So in other words, the policy regime influenced institutions as much as institutions influenced policy. And that relates to a more general point, which just picking out Lant's successful cases, they're almost entirely in Asia, almost entirely in East Asia, apart from India. And there is the obvious question is, are there regional spillovers occurring? And I think the answer is yes. Partly there's an issue of what's sometimes called competitive liberalisation, keeping up with neighbours. You can think of lots of country examples where this has worked. Vietnam's reforms were really triggered by keeping up with China. Korea earlier modelled itself on catching up and then maybe even overtaking Japan. Singapore had this deep sense of vulnerability. The best book on Singapore was written by someone who called it Managing Vulnerability. And Philippines reform, by the way, really took off after the country kicked out the US bases. It felt alone. It had to develop. So thinking about that broader context is kind of interesting. Okay, how am I going for time? I think I've got 5 minutes left, Tetsushi.
Oh,
Is
yes.
that correct? Okay, so I better speed up. So next lot of comments, I'll go more quickly. First of all, looking back on the success stories. So when I think about especially the Asian development success stories, because they're the main ones in the world, you think of these major turning points where leaders and societies often wanted to grow faster. So I date that as China 1978, Vietnam 1986, Indonesia 1966, India 1991. Different reasons, sometimes crises, political and economic, sometimes just wanting to grow faster. So the crucial point Lant makes is that institutional quality at the time of takeoff in almost all these cases was not at all high. But the point was that economic openness, integration of various kinds, reasonably good macroeconomics, ensuring the benefits were spread reasonably broadly, led to this period of exceptional growth, you know, the East Asian miracle, the Growth Commission and all that stuff. So the question is, posed by Lant is this growth durable? And this is where the state capability notion becomes central. I'll skip over what I was going to say, but I think the jury's still out. I'm not convinced that these countries are now afflicted by slower growth. I know there's an empirical and also a conceptual argument that they may be, but I'm not convinced. I think that's a central question that, in a way, one of the questions that Lant poses later on. One of the points he makes, by the way, which is really central, is this notion of dualistic policy regimes. And you see them in all the success countries. You know, Cambodia, a predatory state in some respects, with due respect to our Cambodian friends, but with a very successful Phnom Penh economic zone, business park. In Vietnam, the export zones alongside the state enterprise sector in the non-tradables. So almost all countries have them, but in different degrees. The question really is, in these dualistic sectors, in these dualistic economies, which sector is going to grow, which is going to overtake the other one? And that's I think, a question where you need country analysis supplemented by these big comparative stories to actually make comments. Along the way, also, what's interesting is to look at countries where apparently institutional quality, or whatever you want to call it, was actually quite good, but you didn't get the growth. Lant referred to some of these in his presentation. One of the countries which I happen to have worked on a bit, Sri Lanka, is an interesting case study because in many respects it had all the preconditions for successful economic development. Remember in Lee Kuan Yew's memoir, he said something like, it was a model colony and I wish that Singapore could be as developed as Colombo. And yet it got overtaken by domestic events, even though formerly institutional quality wasn't bad. In fact, many would argue quite good. It got overtaken, as we know, sadly, by ethnic chauvinism, civil war, and then a profligate fiscal policy under the Rajapaksa regime. So the lesson I'm trying to draw from cases like this is that sometimes you may get pretty good state capability, but it's no guarantee of good policy, and vice versa, obviously. So final set of comments, and it relates a little bit to what Tetsushi mentioned in one of his remarks, and that is, do we have to think about the global environment, the global economic and political context? And that's another paper, but clearly it's going to be relevant. Could climate change seriously disrail countries' economic growth? Looks quite likely. Are we in an era where you've now got such fundamentally disruptive geostrategic, political, and economic competition between the great powers that countries are going to find it much more difficult to grow? The optimistic scenario is that even in the, I've almost finished, Mr. Chair, even in these very difficult times, for example, as the latest ADO, the ADB's flagship, points out, countries are still managing to grow quite quickly, post-COVID especially. So the countries singled out by the ADO report, India, Vietnam, followed by Philippines and Indonesia. So we needn't be too gloomy, but the big question that Lant poses is certainly on the table. I buy a lot of it, and some bits I still worry about, but that's the nature of economics, and he sets up the research questions really well. So thanks again, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this interesting conference, and back to the chair.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hal, for the great comments and questions. Lant, would you respond to some part, not all, of Hal's comments and questions before taking the questions from the floor? Which do you like? Please unmute. Lant, can you hear me?
You're still muted, Lant.
Yeah, sorry, I could hear you, but I wasn't.
Okay, so will you respond immediately or after taking some questions from the floor?
Let me take some questions from the floor, because
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are some
I think some of these questions we'll maybe come back to as well. So
yeah, so let me ask on behalf of those audience two questions. One is thank you very much, and the empirically how the state capability improve over time. So suddenly, very quickly, or taking long time. So can there be any big bang change in the state capability or slower progress? This is one question. And another is question about the leader. So how does leadership affect? This is a question from Ritsky, the variant. I think he's a master's student at GRIPS, policy school in Tokyo. So, for example, in the context of Indonesia's new president, how do you see this leadership, new leader will affect this kind of relationship, state capability, and development?
So the first question I think is super important, because from everything we've seen, both in the data and in reality, if you think about dynamics, when we took dynamics in PhD programs and we took this macro stuff with jump variables and flow variables, right? Part of the difficulty of coming to equilibrium is some things can jump and some things are stocks and they have to be accumulated over time. State capability, in the sense that I mean it, of organizational capability, is a very slow moving stock. And that is super central to our thinking about this question in two ways. One, you can change, you can have an election and change the government overnight, but whoever is the government confronts exactly the same organizations. And by and large, the political is a jump variable, right? You can shift regimes through irregular transfers, you can have revolutions, you can have new elections where parties shift, but the state capability, the behavior of organizations is very hard to make dramatic jumps in. So just, and so that's important for because politics is a jump variable. The second is laws are a jump variable. We can pass a law, right? We, meaning any country's legislature or however it goes about passing it. But the capability to enforce a law is not a jump variable. So I think one of the ways in which we've gotten these dynamics wrong is to treat state capability, the underlying organizational capability, as a jump variable, and assume that if we pass a law, we can necessarily enforce it, or we can bring the capability to enforce it. And so oftentimes governments will pass new laws without adequate attention to how am I going to create the dynamics to enforce it. So I think the fact that state capability is a very slow moving stock variable is important in thinking through these dynamics. And it's part and parcel why when governments want to accelerate their growth, they recognize that I have to accelerate it with the capability I have, which often leads them to these cocooned deals. We'll set up export zones in which I can, create capability inside the zone that I know I don't have the time or necessarily ability to create outside the zone. So that's super important. A good question. Second.
Lant, before going to the second, I have a question. So when the state capability goes up, it takes time. But
takes a lot
how
of
about the going down phase? Destroy the state capability, isn't it not difficult?
I think it's, yes, that's a good point too. I think it's easier to get in a downward spiral and deteriorate capability, in part because, I'm an economist and I like to think in incentives and motivate, but one of the things about strong organizations is the internal norms that are internalized by the people in those organizations are important, right? ADB is what ADB is because it has a norm of here's what people at the ADB do. And I don't know if you know, in the presentation, I mentioned a couple of times, strongly normed organizations, right? Once those norms start to deteriorate, you're in a multiple equilibria. You can be an army, and an army necessarily has cooperation and coordination among its various pieces. Once you destroy that coordination of an army, it's a mob, right? And you can have a huge number of people in your army and zero effective fighting power once you destroy the coordination. So I do think you're right, particularly for particular organizations. You can destroy capability much faster than you can rebuild it because it's very hard to rebuild norms, right? If you're in a police force that's corrupt and you've been inculcated yourself in that culture of corruption, in which there's acceptable and unacceptable norms about what kinds of corruption police can engage in, it's very hard to turn that norm around. But deteriorating norms, unfortunately, I think is easier than creating them. So good point. I think it's asymmetric, but I think, okay. The second question.
The worry is very high when the leader is replaced by new one, right? So please go to the next point about leadership.
Well, this is, which is exactly, the next point is exactly, I think, this. I think it's very much harder for a leader to do good than for a leader to do bad. Because once the leader of the country endorses in any way, shape, or form, deviations and uses public sector organizations to collect rents and, bribes or to punish his enemies, it creates, again, rapid norm deterioration of the organization itself. So I think whereas a leader like Lee Kuan Yew, it took him decades and decades and decades to create the high levels of internalized norm that constitute the high performance of Singapore. So and this is one thing, this is the hardest thing I think about leadership in low capability countries is you want to deliver results fast, but the dynamics of organizations are slow, and the leadership it takes to create that you're reflecting internalizing norms of compliance and concern with progress inside the public sector generally. That's just super hard because you come in, you're president of a country, you're chief minister of a state, the police are corrupt, the taxes have been, you come into a miasma and building that forward is very, very hard.
Mm-hmm.
So and very few leaders are dynamic enough to really, make dramatic changes, or it starts from, everybody points to Paul Kagame and Rwanda.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, that's a 1 in 100, that's a 1 in 1,000 kind of set of circumstances that lead to a single leader being able to have that kind of impact.
I see. So how about the comments or questions from the Professor Haru here?
So I think this gets to Sandy. Sandy asked a question. How does state capability improve over time in those high income, high state capabilities that gradually slow pace change or big bang political shocks? And the answer is very slow progress. If you, one of the differences between being a developed country and the leading countries is, in 1910 United States, no one was dramatically ahead of you, right? So you knew you had to we with our co-authors on state capability, we call it the hard slog. It's just a hard slog. And it takes a long time. Creating, a professionalized civil service. One of the famous actors in the American history and the what we call the progressive movement in the early 20th century was Teddy Roosevelt. He actually wrote the legislation for a professionalized civil service in New York State, I think in 1890, and only in 1921 did it become adopted. So we have to reconcile ourselves to how do we keep these differential paces of change all aligned when we know we're trying to do things with ambition on some fronts, but not leave it behind. And the easiest thing to do is, like I say, to carve out exceptions and say, well, we need this investment from this foreign investor, so we're just going to create a deal for this foreign investor. And then, whether that's create a good precedent or a bad precedent is very difficult.
Yeah.
So,
yes. So that's related to the final question. So,
yeah.
Lant, which do you like better? The American democracy plus terrible populist leader, and Chinese democracy with excellent leader. I asked the same question to the Francis Fukuyama.
But I think I think I radically prefer the stability and rule of law of American institutions to the porousness, is a polite word I'll use, of Chinese institutions. So the fact that the Chinese can turn on successful billionaires from one day to the next means that something about the way China is operating is still very porous, and you can't secure your expectations in the rule of law. So, when I go to get a driver's license in my state It brings tears to my eyes that I take a number and wait in line, and the law is enforced for me exactly like it's enforced for everyone else. So I think Trump plays a dictator on TV. He is, he's the leader. He gets a lot of attention. Everybody likes to talk about Trump. But the fundamental core of governance in America is going to be unaffected by Trump. China, by relying on excellent leaders and weak institutions, is more at risk.
Okay, so thank you very, very much for the very nice, very extremely interesting presentation, extremely important research questions, and very kindly answering all the questions. Thank you very much. And the same to the Professor Haruhi. Thank you very much for the excellent comments. Yeah, thank you very much.